So let's delve into our 5 different areas, the fundamentals of warehouse operations, and we're going to talk about the receiving process. Emphasis on process. All of the activities related to the delivery and receipt of goods into a warehouse. So things like driver check-in. Not unusual, certainly in the United States and markets around the world, that for the process to begin, the receiving process of goods into a warehouse, the driver has to check in. Might be at a security gate, might be in a caged area within a warehouse, depends on the layout of a building and a footprint, but it's not unusual to have a driver check in, and as we see in our second bullet point, be assigned a dock door for truck arrival. Now, depending on the layout of a building, that might not be such a big deal if it's a smaller building, but if you're talking about large facilities with 100 dock doors and hundreds of trucks coming out in and out of a facility every day, that becomes an important process. So that's a consideration we need to bear in mind as well. Third bullet point is the documentation review. Of course, there's always the physical delivery of merchandise, but we want to match up documentation with the physical goods. And in the very least, a truck driver, upon attempting to make a delivery, attempting to have goods received into a warehouse, is going to have a transport document, a truck bill of lading, and ideally a commercial invoice and or packing list. These documents, again, hearkening back to some of our previous conversations, are integral to this documentation trail and the handoff of both goods and documentation from one party to the next throughout the supply chain. Not unusual as well, looking at our final bullet point here, to have a visual inspection, a cargo review by the warehouse employees in the presence of the truck driver that's doing the delivery. So things like a piece count. The packing list says 100 pieces, 100 cartons. Well, let's make sure that there's 100 cartons there. Are the goods properly packaged and labeled pursuant to a standard operating procedure that was likely prepared long before goods being delivered? Things like weight, dimensions for certain, definitely in an international environment, and most definitely for air freight shipments, anyone receiving goods into a warehouse is going to take the dimensions of the cartons to determine whether the transportation charges are going to be based on actual or volume weight. Again, a topic we talked about previously. Eyeballing for damages. Do we have an over delivery? We got 102 pieces instead of 100, or under 98 versus 100. All of those things. The specific steps associated with the warehouse receiving process have to be identified ahead of time and mapped out accordingly. So these are some examples of what they might be as related to a cargo review. Continuing on with some receiving process considerations, bringing some technology into the scenario. Are we scanning goods into the system, or are we keying goods into the system manually? Can't make the assumption that the technology is everywhere. Lots and lots of facilities in the United States and around the world still don't have scanning technology in their receiving areas, so we can't make that assumption. If we do scan, does the scan match existing orders in the system, which is to say that the system was expecting this order? Does it match what the system is showing? Or, as I said, do we have to manually input the information into the system to get it recognizable, to gain some visibility that we alluded to earlier? Upon completing the order receiving process, and again, integral to the documentation trail, those 3 C's of documentation that we've talked about, we have to issue a warehouse receipt. That truck driver has to have proof that they delivered the goods in good standing. So that warehouse receipt, or what's sometimes referred to as a forwarder's cargo receipt, if goods are being delivered to a freight forwarder's warehouse, has to be issued. One thing we may also consider is that the realization that every order, every delivery, every receipt into a warehouse isn't going to be perfect. There may be pieces missing. There may be extra pieces. Maybe one was opened. Maybe one carton was kicked in the corner. we may want to have in place, depending on the nature of the goods and the policies of the organization, what's called a conditional receiving process, which is whereby, okay, we will receive goods, there's a shortage, there's a short, there's an over, there's an open box, there's a damaged carton, but we have to make a notation of that in writing that will be acknowledged by the trucker upon delivery. That's a conditional receiving process. Some companies, depending on, again, the nature of the product and what they're doing, won't allow for conditional receiving. Either it's all there in good order, or they don't receive. That's a policy decision that has to be made. But lots of companies will have a conditional receiving process. For those companies that will not receive on a conditional basis, there also has to be a cargo rejection process in writing. And then at the tail end of this whole receiving process, we have to enable put-away activities. Maybe it's being put aside in a marshaling area for immediate export that night for an air freight shipment. Or maybe it's hundreds of pallets of, let's go back to washing detergent, that has to be stored in pallet positions. That's a put-away activity. So we want the receiving process to be clean and identifiable and measurable, but also be able to integrate into that put-away activity should put-away take place.